Oh, I should. Yeah, start filming. Okay, so thank you all for coming out. It's not the most pleasant of weather, but here we all are. My name is Jesse Villay-Vitao. I am the president of SFU AMB. And to quickly point out some of our volunteers. Behind the booth, we have Annie and Gigi. We have Liam behind the camera, video camera, and Jared behind the camera. So first things first, we're going to do the territorial land acknowledgement. Somewhere here. We acknowledge that Simon Fraser University is located on unceded Indigenous land belonging to the Coast Salish peoples. Unceded means that the land was never surrendered, relinquished, or handed over in any way. Based on our current knowledge, this includes the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Stolo, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. That being out of the way, I am going to tell you a little bit about the organization that we are. SFUMB, Simon Fraser University Advocacy for Men and Boys. We first started about a year and 3 or 4 months ago, in July or June of last year. And we've been very successful as far as clubs go since then. All of the people at the booking office for the university are tired of seeing my face. One of our big initiatives this year, since September, has been we're agitating for a permanent space to deal with men's issues on campus and men's issues in general. One of our presenters today, Dr. Lysova, is actually helping sponsor our research into the ways that men are disadvantaged on campus and the way that the services that are currently provided don't actually deal with their problems in a way that would be most effective. Contrary to popular belief, we have never actually been protested here. We have always had open dialogue and respectful audiences, and we hope to see this continue in the future and see no reason why it should not. And there's been growing support for what we've been doing. We've had reporters come and talk to us from various publications, the Georgia Strait. We had our last event, feedback actually, about men's suicide was covered by the province as well as the National Post. And that's partially thanks to all of the wonderful community members who keep coming out to our events and spreading the word. So thank you all. We have a similar event going on tomorrow with a different speaker, Dr. Tanya Nichols, who will be speaking on the same idea, male victims of domestic violence, and that is taking place at the UBC. It will be called Untold Suffering, and it will just feature further expansion on this topic. It's well worth attending if you can find the time. So I'm going to go over a little bit of an outline of our night tonight. We're going to have our first speaker, then our second speaker, then a 10-minute break, then a Q&A session for both speakers, and then a giveaway based on responses to our survey, which we will hand out during that 10-minute break or the Q&A session. Before we get started, though, a word from our sponsor, the Canadian Association for Equality. Please welcome Phil Johnston.
Thanks, Jesse. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm very excited about what we're about to witness tonight. I think it's going to be a very special evening. So my name again is Philip Johnston. I'm the branch director of CAFE Vancouver, Canadian Association for Equality. CAFE is a registered charity in Canada, an educational charity that's focused on gender equality, and particularly the inequities that men and boys face in society. And some of those inequities, those issues, include the underachievement of boys in education, the high rates of suicide in the male population, and the glaring lack of resources for male victims of intimate partner violence, and the other issues that we also advocate for. So our work consists mostly of advertising campaigns, and also sponsoring events like the one tonight. So we've been sponsoring the SFUMB for over a year now, and we've successfully set up another club, I'm happy to say, at the University of the Fraser Valley. They'll be having their first event this Wednesday on boys in education. We're actually, Jesse also mentioned that there's an event tomorrow at UBC. We're looking to set up a club at that university as well. So one of the many accomplishments of CAFE National has been to set up the first Canadian Centre for Men and Families. And this space is really one of a kind in Canada. A dedicated space for resource for men and families in need. And the Vancouver chapter here wants to create a center like that as well. One of the things we're doing to move towards that is very soon we'll be launching a monthly group called the CVLC, which is the Cafe Vancouver Legal Clinic, and that will be for men who have faced legal issues in the areas of criminal or family law, where men are often face marginalization or bias. So we'll be setting that up, and we'd also like to set up a support group for male victims of intimate partner violence. To do those things, I want to ask for your help. So if you'd like to see those services created, if you'd like to see a center come to Vancouver, please consider donating. There's a table outside. You can do it there, and any amount is welcome. And of course, your time is also valuable to us if you'd like to get more involved. I know many faces here already are, but if you're someone who's new here and if you'd like to get involved, please come speak to me and you can become a volunteer. So finally, if you're not on our mailing list, you can join at the table outside. And if you want more information, just go to equalityvancouver.com. I'll now hand the floor back to Jesse. Thank you very much. So without further ado, our first speaker has for 30 years operated a successful Toronto-based consulting practice specializing in organizational development and culture. He is also a survivor of intimate partner violence. Tonight he'll share his story, including his path to recovery. Please welcome Michael Healey.
Thank you, and thanks Jesse, and thank you to the SFU AMB for hosting this event, and to Cafe for sponsoring it. I'm just going to ask a quick question before we get started, and it's simply this. How many of you have somewhere else you could be right now? Anybody? Or something else you could be doing? Yeah. Yeah, anybody have nothing else? That's the best you can? Just okay, yeah, just wanted to check, thanks. The reason I ask that question is I understand your time is valuable, your time, and you got lots of other things you can do. So I do appreciate you being here this evening for this event. And I know I've talked to the organizers and Alexandra, and our goal here is to make it, a valuable investment of your time. So we're going to present hopefully some interesting ideas and some thoughtful and thought-stimulating ideas, and maybe even some paradigm-expanding ideas and discussions. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story, and I'll be very frank about it. What I'm going to talk about tonight is definitely anecdotal. It's my story, but it's also the story of some other men as well. I've been doing a lot of speaking around. I'm from Toronto, so around the greater Toronto area, I do a lot of speaking and connect with a lot of men, and I find it interesting and disturbing, I guess, that when I tell my story, there's a lot of other men out there with similar stories. And so I'm going to share a little bit of some of their stories as well. But it'll definitely be anecdotal. I know Alexandra will be up here later with some really solid research. And so I'll leave the scholarly pieces to her. So let me start with the other thing that I want to speak to is some of the myths that are out there about intimate partner violence, which is what we're talking about tonight. It's also sometimes called domestic violence and domestic abuse. Intimate partner violence is more of a phrase that encompasses everything, including dating violence, etc. Where we think of domestic violence, it's usually couples that are living together. So we're going to cover that whole basis. And the first myth that I want to address is this one, and it is that women aren't as strong as men, and then the therefore of that is that may actually be true, but it's ridiculous to think that they could physically assault a man. Anybody kind of heard that? Yeah, exactly. And it's a narrative that's out there, and it's one that I believed actually until just recently. And then when a woman is physical with a man, it's always an act of self-defense. Anybody heard that? Yeah. So let me tell you a story just to kind of paint a picture for you. I was with a woman in an intimate relationship, lived with her for almost 5 years. And over that period of time, this was progressive. It didn't happen all at once, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that story as we go on here. But one of the culminating events that speaks to this myth that we have here, that I will call a myth, is this one. And just think about this. I'm a fairly big guy. I literally weigh twice as much as my partner. And yet, she had a history of getting very violent. And as a matter of fact, she went into these, like a switch was thrown into a rage. We'd be having a very benign conversation, and the next thing you know, she was in a rage. And she had a history of hitting me, of throwing things at me. I know some of you are going to find this funny, but pulling my hair was onto my chest, basically. She'd grab me here and yank. And that was always when she was in a rage, and I could see it on her face. So this one day we were sitting in the kitchen, and we were having another benign conversation, and she was chopping some vegetables, and just in the split second, it went from a benign conversation to her being in a blind rage. She had a 10-inch chopping knife in her hand, and she started walking towards me. So in that moment, I had a couple of choices. You know, I did try and talk her out of it. I said, please put the knife down, please put the knife down, but that didn't happen. She kept walking towards me. She got to be about 2 or 3 feet away from me, and my natural instinct was to defend myself, but I chose to run away. And I realized afterwards that that was actually the right choice, because if there had been blood and the police arrived, who do you think would have been arrested? Yeah, probably me. I can't say for sure, but I know from talking to enough other men that it does happen in those types of situations. So I was lucky I got out of there, and that was all fine, like in terms of my physical safety. But it just goes to speaks to this concept that women can't hurt men. I mean, of the men that I've spoken to, there are men who have been, punched in the face and had their nose broken, sucker punched. Another man that I know who was a professional football player, played in the CFL for 4 years, and his wife of 25 years came up behind him and with 2 fists hit him in the back and broke ribs, and he said he'd never been hit that hard in his life, and he was a professional football player, knocked the wind out of him, knocked him down. So that this concept that men can't hit men or can't do damage, it's just not true. It is simply a myth. So moving on here, myth number 2 is that even if a woman did hit a man, it couldn't actually hurt the man. So I've already talked a little bit about that, but I want to add to this a little bit, this whole concept of hurting men, because a lot of the research and a lot of the narrative, a lot of the conversation out there is about the physical aspect of hurting men. And I can tell you, with absolute certainty that the hurt that I suffered was not the physical violence. It was the other forms of violence. So let me tell you a little bit about where I ended up and then how I got there. So by the end of the 5 years of the relationship, I ended up in a place where I had pretty severe anxiety. I was almost non-functional as a human being. I had depression. I won't say I was curled up in a fetal position, but I was pretty close to it. We were in separate rooms. I stayed in my room all the time. If I came out of my room, she would follow me around the house and harangue me, criticize me, demean me, put me down. If I stayed in my room too long, she'd actually come in the room and stand in the door and harangue me and criticize me and demean me. And if I tried to get up and leave, she'd block the door and stand in the door, almost daring me to touch her. I never did. But one time she got so angry that she was demeaning me and I wasn't doing anything. I was just sitting there not looking at her, not talking. She got so angry she started hitting her head against the door frame. That's how mad she was, because she couldn't do anything to me. She tried to throw coffee on my dog, hot coffee. She kicked my dog. And the emotional and physical abuse was happening all the time. But where I got to was I got to a place, literally, that it was manifesting physically in me. I had severe pain in my solar plexus, in my stomach, my back, my shoulders. I couldn't walk over to that door without being short of breath and dizzy. I thought I was having heart problems, heart failure. The other part was I was losing my mind. and there's something I'll talk a little bit more about. It's called gaslighting. It's basically crazy making, and there's a specific way that people can go about doing it. But I was getting to a point where I couldn't string a sentence together. I couldn't remember anything. She would tell me she told me one thing the day before, and then I would think, no, she didn't tell me that. And after you hear that, once, you think, oh no, that's her problem. If you hear it 100 times, you start going, I wonder whose problem this is. And you hear it 200 times, you start thinking it's my problem. And to just really illustrate that, about 2 weeks before I ended up leaving the relationship, I decided that I was leaving. And one of the things that people tell you who are supporting you in leaving will tell you to make an emergency plan, plan to leave. And one of the things they'll do is tell you to make a list of things to take with you. And I thought, hey, that's a great idea. I'm going to make a list. So 2 weeks before I left, I started making my list. My actual mental acuity was so debilitated at that time that after 2 weeks of 24 hours a day, my only job was to make a list. Any idea how many things I had on my list after 2 weeks?
3.
It was 4, yeah, close, it was 4. I had 4 things on my list. That's all I could come up with. I could have just looked around and saw more than 4 things, but that's all I could do, that's all I could think, And so I spent all my time, being depressed and anxious and trying to fend off the attacks, and I couldn't even think. So that's the point that I got to. So the reason that I'm telling that story in that way is that this idea that women can't hurt men, it's false just in the idea of it being physical, because they can use weapons, etc. But they can also use a lot of other tools as well in order to hurt men. And I think, for me, I played hockey, I played football, I've blocked shots, I've gone up against big linemen, I've done all of that. I would rather she hit me in the face in a way that I could, say, look, this is happening to me, than the psychological and emotional abuse that I was subjected to, I guess, if you will. So the other thing was that, I want to also say she also kind of restricted my emotions. I want to talk a little bit about this. I want to talk about some of my experiences, but not from the point of view of what I call perpetrator blaming. There's no excuse for what she did, but at the same time, I don't want to be up here and just blame. But I do want to talk about some of the things that she did from this perspective. As I said, I've talked to a lot of men, and the men that I talked to many of them experienced some of these things, and many of them are like me. One of my problems was that even late in the relationship, if someone had said to me, "Are you being abused?" I would have said no. And I wouldn't have understood really what abuse meant. I didn't really get it. I thought, what, I can take it. It's not that bad. I had a lot of reasons for staying, and I'm going to talk to that in a moment. But the reason that I want to talk about some of the things that actually happened is because when I talk to men, one of the things I really hear men saying is that, oh yeah, that happened to me, but I didn't know it was abuse. Because we've been kind of socialized that men need to put up with that, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to talk about some of those things. And in fact, even just really define what intimate partner violence is. Now, I'm going to use a framework that works for this discussion. I know the academics and government agencies use different terms and so on, and I think Alexandra's probably going to go into more detail about some of these specifics. So I'm just going to use a very general framework. So we're going to talk about intimate partner violence, domestic violence, domestic abuse, and talk about some of the different categories, I guess you will. So there's the physical abuse. And physical abuse isn't just hitting. It can be hitting, but it can also be shoving and slapping and kicking and throwing things at you or threatening to throw things at you. It can be as well as anytime you sort of feel threatened, then that is the abuse. So I felt that, or I would say that the physical abuse is also when my partner would come at me, with fists like this. Sometimes she'd hit me, sometimes she wouldn't. She always hit me in somewhere that was, muscle mass, so it never left any bruises. She never hit me in the face. That's not true about, I know lots of men who have been hit in the face and scratched and so on. The next one I've already talked about a little bit is, psychological abuse. Psychological abuse can look like maybe she, for me, it was about alienating me in my relationships. I had two boys that were at the time 17 and 18 from a previous relationship, and she found ways of interrupting that relationship. And one of the ways that she did it, it's very subtle. But again, I'd like you to think about if this is happening to you or you know somebody this is happening to. It's often very subtle. So one of the things that she would do with that relationship is, or with to interrupt the relationship with my sons, is that when we have an agreement to get together, as an example, one of my sons, had invited him over to our house to have his birthday dinner. I was going to make him dinner, which was a tradition that we had. It was on a Saturday evening, and so he was going to come over, and we'd set up the menu in advance and gone through all of those preparations. And then at noon on that Saturday, she said, I don't want him to come. So now I had to go to my son and change the agreement. I had to take him out for dinner instead of having him over, and it was alienating. She would do things like when they were there, she would often, when my sons were at the house, she would often make it inhospitable for them in a variety of ways, just do little things. But again, nothing really major, but enough to make it difficult. One time my son and I were going to go to the art gallery together, and she was going to come with us. It was Saturday morning. We wake up on a Saturday morning, and she says, I don't want to go, I don't feel like going. So I take the one car that we have, I take the car, and I'm about to take my son. I pick him up at the train station. He was in university. Pick him up at the train station. We're heading off, and she calls me just as my son is coming off the train and says, I need the car today. I have plans. Which clearly her plans were to go to the museum with us, or the art gallery, but all of a sudden she had plans. And then the harangue started, and she called me. I checked on my phone later. She called me 20 times in about 10 minutes or so while I was waiting for my son, telling me, get that car back here now. I'm going to call the police. I'm going to tell them you stole that car. That's I know where you're going. They'll be able to find you, etc., etc. While I'm waiting to pick up my son. She did the same thing with my business. Relationships, when we would agree in advance where I would need the car to go to see a client for something. At the very last minute, she would often take that away. More of the kind of psychological abuse is she would try and keep track of where I was. Where were you? How long were you? Why did it take you so long to drive home? Well, I stopped for a coffee. It was 10 minutes longer. I remember one time that I didn't know she was doing this, but she was actually writing down the mileage on the car when I was leaving. And one time the mileage was longer by about 20 or 30 kilometers than it should have been. And again, she wanted the explanation for why, and I told her why, and she called me a liar, and et cetera, et cetera. So all of those things are kind of the psychological, tracking you. She checked my computer regularly when I left. I figured that out after a while. I would set things on my computer to check and take a picture of it to check that she was going through my computer regularly. Another classic thing is abusers will often, what am I trying to say? They will accuse you of having relationships. So one of the ways I found out she was going through my computer, she went through, and I was on Skype almost all day long, talking to people and texting with people and so on. And when you're on Skype and you're a man and have a male picture on there, you get all kinds of invitations from women to connect with them. When I just block them. And she went on my computer one day and found all of these women who were on my Skype history and accused me of having affairs with all of these women online. And it was interesting because again I kind of just took it in and didn't say too much about it. And then a day later, I actually got one of those invitations while she was at home, and I took it to her to show her, and then she got very angry at me for showing her, saying that I was, I was being defensive and, etc. So I'm giving you all of these again, not to talk about what happened to me per se, but to give you some examples so in case you can see it in your own life. And I'm just looking at my screen here and realizing that I believe that I spelled psychological wrong, so bear with me on that. Pardon me? No, it's good. All right, so there you go. See, I'm still losing my mind. So what else? So there's emotional, things like I talked about, calling names, demeaning, insulting, putting you down in public. That didn't happen in my situation. It was all behind closed doors, but those are all kinds of things that are part of the emotional violence of relationships. Sexual, and that is, I know that's another hard one for some people to understand, that women can actually sexually abuse men. That hasn't happened to me, but I can tell you that I know men that has happened to, and it happens for some of them on a regular basis. Sometimes it only happens occasionally, but it does happen. It is a real phenomenon. Men can be sexually abused in a number of different ways. And basically sexual abuse in this case, we're just talking about any kind of sexual contact or sexual activity that is non-consenting. And then the next one, and this one again, I didn't experience particularly, but it's pretty pervasive out there, and that's what we would call legal administrative abuse. In other words, they're using the system against men, and they use that in a variety of ways. Often they will, women will call the police to get men arrested under false pretenses or false charges. They'll use the courts to get custody of the children. They'll use the courts to drain men of their finances. I know many men who had no reason to not get custody of their children and spent basically all of their money trying to get shared custody, not even full custody, just shared custody of their children. So those are all the ways, and again, the reason I put that out there is just to kind of get used thinking, is this happening to you or someone that you know? So let's talk about myth 3 that I want to speak to, and that is men can just leave. And that's probably true, but I want to tell you a little bit of my story and why I didn't leave. As I said, it started very slowly, and part of it had to do with me personally. I'll just be very honest, part of it was my own psychology. I have been in a succession, or had been in a succession of violent relationships and abusive relationships over my life. And it started slowly. I talked about that switch. And in the beginning, that switch only went off about maybe 2% of the time. And then over time, it started going off more often, more often, more often, more often. In the last 5 months I was there, it was like 98% of the time that switch was into the violent mode, or the harangue, or the anger. And so it started off slowly, and but there was also a control issue that happened. And so about 1.5 years into the relationship, we made a decision, both of us made the same decision, that I would sell my house and move in with her. We didn't have any agreement about me getting title of her house. And so that was actually a piece of the control, because now that I don't have title of her house, she can kick me out anytime, she can, so there is a measure of control there. The other interesting thing that happened is, and I didn't see it at the time, but I do now, I see it as a piece of control, because I understand some of the psychology behind people who have abusive tendencies, is that almost literally as soon as I moved in with her, after I sold my house, so you can see that I had restricted some of my options for leaving. I'd sold my house, moved in with her, and we stopped having sex at her insistence, I guess. She had all kinds of excuses, reasonable ones, that went for a period of time. But here's the interesting part that I want to speak to as well, and this is part of that kind of abusive personality, is that one of the things that she did very early in the relationship, and this is part of the control concept, is she mined my vulnerabilities. we had lots of conversation. She was always asking me questions about my vulnerabilities. And for me, I thought, oh wow, this is a person who really loves me. She's compassionate and caring and interested in me and wanting to help me. And so I told her everything. I opened up. And then what happened is, one of the things I opened up about is that I hadn't felt like I'd had a very fulfilling sex life anytime in my life. You know, I had never had a relationship with a woman who I really felt I connected with sexually. And it's interesting that then she then used that against me, you know, recreated that. I talked about, as my children were getting older, I thought I was a really good father up until they were about in their mid-teens, and then I felt like I was ahead of the curve up until that time, and then by their mid-teens I felt like I was getting behind the curve. They were changing faster than I could keep up, and I noticed afterwards that she used that against me on a regular basis. So all those vulnerabilities that I talked about, they all get used against me at some point in time, and that's more of that part of that control elements. And the other major control element that she was able to use against me, and I was a participant in this, I fully own that part of it, is I was in the process of transitioning in my business. I've been working with primarily social service agencies for years, and I decided that I wanted to transition my business and work for for-profit agencies. And she encouraged that. She said, yeah, you know, let's do that. And I will, you know, if you don't have any income for a while, that's fine. I will cover your salary, etc. And so I did. I stopped taking new clients in the old model and was working on building a new model. And as soon as I stopped taking clients, that's when the emotional, psychological abuse got ramped up. You know, I remember the first time I actually made a call to a client. And I've been working on my, you know, sales pitch, etc., for a couple of months, and I had told her how I was feeling insecure about it, and, you know, was hoping that it was going to work, and worrying about it, and being anxious about it. And she happened to be home when I made that call, and I made the very first call to the client. And after I hung up the phone, she came into my office and she said, "You're going to have to do better than that. Nobody's going to buy from you if you talk like that on the phone. You sounded like you had no idea what you're talking about. You lacked confidence. You're never going to make it." That's psychological abuse, you know, that's emotional abuse. She found those buttons, but I had told her what those buttons are. So the last thing I want to tell you about it, and this is, again, it's about me. And what happened is about 2 weeks into the relationship, the very first time that she was angry, she'd come to my house. We were still living in separate houses. She'd come to my house, and it was a November evening. It was kind of like it is here right now. It was dark and rainy, and she was supposed to arrive at like 7 o'clock at night. She didn't get there till about 7:30, and you know, I was a little bit worried about her, but she finally got there. And when she got there, I said, "Oh, you know, I'm so glad you made it. Was everything okay?" And she went into a rage at me because she couldn't find my house. And, you know, she was mad at me. And I realized after that, you know, that was a problem. After I got out of the relationship, when I started looking at it, I realized that somebody who was healthy, and I wasn't, somebody who was, you know, psychologically healthy, would have looked at that and probably said, "Wow, that's extreme," or would have looked at it and said, "You know what, I'm out of here. I'm not up for that." I looked at it this way, and this comes partly from my history, but I looked at it this way. I went, "Oh, there's someone I can help." And so part of the reasons that I didn't leave is because I believed that it was my job to help her. So, you know, I was always looking at ways to help her. I thought I could fix her, if you will. So that was number one, the reason I didn't leave. I thought throughout the whole relationship that it was really my job to help her. That was my job. I didn't see it as abuse. I already talked about that. You know, it wasn't until a long time therapists were telling me. I'd gone to a few therapists, and they were saying, "You know, that's pretty abusive." And I was thinking, well, yeah, maybe, but you know, it's not that big of a deal. Ultimately, I became embarrassed and then shamed once it got on too long, and I was thinking of leaving. I didn't want to tell my family. I didn't know, you know, I was embarrassed. Another failed relationship. I was also began to get worried that people wouldn't believe me because I wasn't getting hit, you know. So who's going to believe me that a woman is being mean to me, and that's the reason why I can't work and I can't think and I can't walk across the room without passing out, you know? Who's going to believe that? And the last one is, you know, I thought the relationship breakdown was my fault. And I had actually really good evidence. I had empirical evidence that it was my fault. And here's my evidence. If I went to her family, or if I went to her workplace, or her friends, and told them what she did to me behind closed doors, they wouldn't believe me. They would have called me a liar, because she did not look like that out in the community. She looked like a very nice, she had a master's degree in psychology. She worked as a psychologist with children, you know. She was very normal. And so for me, if I look at that evidence, I say, okay, when she's out in the community, this is who she is. When she's with me, this is who she is. What's the factor there? Me. Clearly, I'm the problem. So I couldn't go tell anybody that this was happening in a way because I was the problem. I had to go tell them, you know what, I'm a problem. When I went and told my therapist that, she said, no, she's the problem, but I didn't really believe it. So, having said all that, I want to talk a little bit about my journey to recovery. And I'll do that quickly because I'm going to leave some time here for the Q&A. I was very fortunate. One of the problems was that I couldn't find any services originally. I called some shelters and in where I was living, and there wasn't really anything for men. And I got very lucky that a hub for people who have been in violent relationships referred me to the Canadian Centre for Men and Families. And I started to some of their programs, some individual therapy and also some group therapy. And I found the group therapy has been very, very helpful, therapeutic. And so from that, I started to recover. And even just coming in and talking is, you know, really good for my recovery as well. But I started to try and work with the Canadian Centre for Men and Families, which is the services arm of CAFE, the Canadian Association for Equality, and trying to develop programs to bring the Canadian, you know, the services arm, which only has Toronto as a location right now, bring that across the country. So that's my goal right now, is to try and bring those services to all the CAFE offices across the country. So that's one of the reasons that I'm here tonight. I thank you again for being here and listening, and I'm looking forward to having a Q&A, and I'm also looking forward to seeing and hearing Alexandra's presentation. So thank you very much.
We'll be having one general Q&A at the end of both speeches where you can ask any questions you have to both of our presenters. Thanks again to Michael for sharing that with us and for his speech. So, thank you. Our next speaker wrote a PhD thesis focused on the study of intimate partner violence, where she found 200 studies that documented equal rates of intimate partner violence perpetration by women and men. She is currently working towards correcting the record through research that IPV is not a gender problem, and that male victims are faced today with little to no resources to help them. Please welcome Dr. Alexandra Lysova.
Thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk here today. Thank you, Michael, for sharing this and for sharing your story. And I think you will find very many similarities with what I will be presenting as the result of the international study on male victims in 4 English-speaking countries. It's the first time I've heard what Michael said about his experience of violence, and there are many, many similarities with what we found in experiences of men are in the United States, in Canada, in the UK, and Australia. This is our study. But before I actually turn to the work we did, I actually would like to start with the kind of looking at the background of this issue on male victims and why it is quite difficult to study male victims. As a researcher, I can say it feels kind of a resistance in this field. Sometimes it's hard to talk about it. Sometimes there are issues with presenting these findings at the conferences. So I would like to start with this first, and then so there will be two questions. First, I will talk about these kind of issues in the field. Second, I'll be talking about the Canadian statistics, Canadian official data on male victims. Do they exist? How many of them are there? And finally, I will be presenting results of our international study on male victims. And I called my topic as embracing the complexities of intimate partner violence or partner violence, because I believe this is a very, very complex issue, and we have to look into the different angles of this issue and kind of embrace them to try to understand it without really taking sides. Again, I'm not sure how much you're aware of the issues and tensions in the field of sociology and criminology in relation to male victims, but it's quite a tense debated area. So that is why actually my argument here is very important to look at different angles of this issue, and I'm focusing on male victims here. I'm not presenting all the results of my dissertation here. This is a new study that I'm working right now, and my dissertation was more on the dynamics of violence in the intimate partner relationships. So I literally haven't found those that 200 studies found gender symmetry in relationship. That was American scholar Murray Strauss who did it. So I'm not quite sure. It was not quite a true representation of what I did in my dissertation, because my dissertation went actually to show more the dynamics of violence in the intimate partner relationships. But this number is true. It's 200 studies really showing the gender symmetry in the relationship. And I'll be talking more about it. So what do we have, what knowledge we have now about male victims of partner violence? So first of all, there's a lot of studies on intimate partner on violence against men in the relationship. However, I have to admit that in the last 5-10 years, there's been an increase in studies of male victims. Something's definitely happening, very positive right now, and probably part of the reason that we have this talk right now, just because the voices of men are starting to be heard. Something is really changing in the field, but it's still a very, very long way to go before we learn as much as we know about female victims of intimate partner violence. Then most of the studies that we have today, most of them show the prevalent rates of violence against men. So we see the number. This percent of men experienced physical violence, this percent of men experienced psychological aggression. We very rarely hear voices of men, like Michael did today. This is a very rare thing, and we need to have more information on that, to hear men's voices. And finally, services for men who became victims of violence are very, very limited. And there are almost no studies that would evaluate those services. So, and a question I ask, we have this situation right now, so the question I ask, why? Why do we have this? Why is this situation in the field that male victims are kind of overlooked, kind of neglected, even though, again, there's been some changes in the field? And I go back to the work of Susan Steinmetz, who was one of the first researchers in sociology, who back in 1977, hard to believe, almost 40 years ago, wrote a paper called The Battered Husband Syndrome. And the question she posed on the first page of that paper was, is husband battering really an unknown phenomenon, or is it simply another example of selective inattention? So her point was, as you can guess, she said it was a case of selective inattention, because even in her paper back in 1977, she already cited statistics on male victims of intimate partner violence. So I pose the same question right now, and I'll show some studies, basically some basic information about, are there any studies, is there any information about male victims out there? So this is the figure created by Murray Strauss, one of the leading scholars in the field of family violence and violence perpetrated by women against men. He's an American scholar, so he created this chart to show that the number of studies from 1975, this is where he conducted the major American study about family violence in the United States in 1975, so grew substantially until 2005. So these studies showed the nearly similar rates of perpetration of violence by women and by men. So my point here is really to focus on that in these studies we see that there are male victims. Clearly there are male victims in the relationships, and these studies suggest this. Since this chart ends in 2005, so I looked into the more recent statistics. And this is the what we know about the very recent studies. The very large review of the literature was conducted by Sarah Desmarais and her colleagues in 2012. They reviewed all studies in the English language journals from 2000 to 2010, and they identified 750 articles. So you see that the number of publications, studies on male victims, or showing that men can be victims of intimate partner violence, increased 750 just in this period of time. For the purposes of meta-analysis or review of the studies, they looked only at the particular number of articles, 111 in case of perpetration, 249 in terms of the victimization. But the point is, the bottom line here is that what they found, look at the rates of perpetration in all these very different studies coming from different settings, from different countries. So 28% of women and 22% of men reported that they perpetrated at least one act of physical violence against the partner in their relationships. So you see that even a bit higher number of women did it than men. But overall, we see what is called a gender symmetry in perpetration. So, and this is what some studies show, that this is what we see in the field. This is what happens. Then let's look at the rates of victimization. And this is what Sarah Desmarais found. 23% of women and 19% of men reported that they've been abused in the relationship. So they experienced physical violence in the relationship. Again, we see that numbers are pretty close. So we do have information about that. However, I have to make here very, very clear that even with the rates of victimization, that men and women, a nearly equal number of them reported that they've been victims of partner violence, there is a gender asymmetry in effects of this violence. And this is very important to realize that. And I guess most of the issues in this field, why it's sometimes hard to talk to people from different theoretical schools, just because some say, no, men cannot be victims, only women are victims. And people from other schools say, no, men also can be victims, just because different statistics is cited. And also because we need to acknowledge that there are gender asymmetry in effects, that most of the studies show that women suffer a great deal of injuries in the result of violence. So women are hospitalized more often than men are in the result of female violence. And women are killed more often in the relationship than the reverse. So it's very important, that is why I call my talk as embracing the complexity. Although we see there is victimization rates are nearly similar, nearly the same, but the effects of these victimizations are different. And this is what is important to acknowledge. So, and this is where I really wanted to make it very, very clear. So a gender asymmetry in effects. Then we go back to the question, is it selective inattention then? The question that Susan Steinmetz asked 40 years ago, is it a selective inattention? I would say yes. Partly yes, because the field of family violence or domestic violence, as it's called differently, has been dominated by one theory, a perspective, called violence against women perspective. Clearly from the name, the focus was on women. And there are many, many benefits of this perspective. They drew attention to females' plight in their relationships. It changed the policies in a very positive way to help female victims of violence. But at the same time, male victims were kind of overlooked and neglected within this perspective. The focus was on women as victims of violence and on men as perpetrators. Again, I'm not saying that the male victims were completely denied. No, even members of this perspective, they say yes, they probably exist, but they're just minority of them. It's just not many of them to talk about them. These are mostly women. So, and the factors of violence that the feminist scholars cited usually were dominance, control, and patriarchy. Again, they looked at some other risk factors that explained victimization of women, but mostly these were this. It's a power, it's a control that men wanted to take over women in the relationship. So this is one explanation why we have this lack of information, that we're still kind of right now trying to get more understanding what's really happening to men in intimate relationships. The other part of the story is the reluctance of men really to talk about it, to report on violence. And it's not kind of definitely not blaming men for that. It's really trying to understand why it happens. And the part of the reason is that there are very strong stereotypes of masculinity out there. That for men, it's very difficult even to acknowledge that they're victims of violence. Who are these? What kind of men are they if they experience violence from a woman? So we have pretty strong attitudes and stereotypes in the society that it makes it very hard for men to acknowledge violence and more willing to go and report it. The other thing, negative judgment by others, not by family members and friends, by agents of law enforcement, by service providers, by neighbors, by people around them. So that's another reason that stops men even from kind of talking about it, going and seeking help. And of course, acceptance of aggression by women. Yes, as Michael already mentioned here, there is an common understanding that when women are violent, it's mostly in self-defense, which is not true. Many studies show that it's not true, and population studies show that there are a variety of factors that motivate women to commit violent acts, not just self-defense. But still, there are many, all kinds of types of stereotypes and myths in comic ways showing men as victims of violence. Moreover, some acts of violence, like slapping a man's face, seems okay when she's angry, when he deserves that, probably that's fine. So again, we hold very different views on violence perpetrated by men against women. That wouldn't be okay. But in case if it happens toward men, but it's all right. We kind of tolerate that. So all kind of comic things, expressions, which is violent against men, our society still tolerates that. So the second issue, so this is where I really wanted to talk a little bit about the tensions in the field and point out on the issues that are still very contested, and we need to embrace the complexity. But the second thing that I wanted to make, to discuss here is the official statistics in Canada. So what does it show? Statistics in Canada is really good, really rigorous, and in Canada there is a family violence statistics collected every year, and this is the most recent statistics on family violence in Canada. This is what we have. So first of all, what I'd like to point attention to is that there are two types of data, not one, two. One is the police reported data, and the other is the victimization survey. So police reported data based on the Uniform Crime Reporting Survey and Homicide Survey. And according to this data, 6% of all male victims of male victims who became victims of violent offenses are victims of spousal violence, 6% of them. And 19% of all female victims of violent offenses are victims of spousal violence. So it translates into over 32,000 women and over 8,000 men. So what we see from here is that we clearly see that there are men who are abused in the spousal relationships. We clearly see that. What we also see that there is a very large gender kind of asymmetry in the reporting of who became victims of violence. Almost 8 in 10 victims of spousal violence are women and girls. This is according to the statistics. So, however, these police statistics provide very important information. However, there is one large limitation. Over 70% of cases of spousal violence are not reported to the police. Data. Over 70% of spousal violence. That is why, that's the reason why in Canada we have a second source of information, and that's called the victimization survey. General Social Survey conducts, every 5 years, conducts a victimization survey. And this is a very important information that kind of supplements the police reported data. Because here, in this victimization survey, people in the random sample, all Canadians have a chance to get into the sample, are asked 11 questions. And these questions are based on the items for the Criminal Code of Canada, exactly about the acts of violence that are in the Criminal Code. Exactly about those acts of violence that actually get to the statistics. So, but here we see very different numbers. Look at these numbers. 4.2% of men and 3.5% of women reported that they've been victimized in the spousal relationships in the last 5 years. So, it translates into 418,000 men and 341,000 women. More men reported that they've been victims of intimate partner violence, those acts that are actually presented in the criminal code. So this is very important to see these big differences between this data. However, if we look at the injuries for men and women in the general social survey, we see that quarter of male victims experience injuries and 40% of women, female victims, experience injuries. So what it says again, we clearly see there are male victims, lots of them, according to the general social survey, and many of them experience violence, quarter of them. But women experience injuries, but more women experience injuries than men. Again, if we embrace the complexity, we clearly see there is definitely a big issue for men, but in terms of the facts, it looks like it's more severe for women. Let's look into some of the details of the police statistics. Something what I found very interesting when I looked in the details of that. So, depending on the types of offense, most of the numbers, proportions of men and women are the same, but there are differences in two types of offenses: sexual offense and aggravated assault. So what we see that in terms of the sexual assault, more women become victims of that type of violence. So we see that 4% of them, comparing to 0.4 for men. And this is quite expected. This is what most of the studies show, not only police statistics, but also surveys. But then what I found very interesting, that look at the major assault, level 2 and 3. Level 2 assault is defined as assault with weapon or causing bodily harm, and level 3 assault is defined as assault that wounds, maims, disfigures, or endangers the life of the victim. So you see 21% of men comparing to 12% of women. What does it suggest? It suggests that most of the men who become victims of the most severe violence get to the statistics, the police reported data. Most of these men who actually experience the most violent type of spousal violence, they get to the statistics. And a couple of more things is just based on victimization survey. Just to show you, we see very big differences also between men and women, female and male victims of intimate partner violence in self-reported violence. That's a victimization survey. Just look at these first upper two types of violence. These are severe forms of violence. One is a sexual assault and beaten, choked, and threatened with a gun or a knife. More men experience this, reported that they experience this type of violence in the relationship. While for men, many more men, 35% versus almost 10% for women, kicked, hit, or hit with something. So again, we see very clear, very big differences between between sexes, even in self-reported data. And finally here in this session, when men and women were asked about if they ever looked for formal support used, if they looked for any formal support, you see that most of those who dated were women. And men, when they tried to find any support, formal support, they actually felt quite unsatisfied with that. So this is the very recent data provided by the victimization survey. So, and this is what the Statistics Canada usually produce. One page summarizing the data. So if you can see that in the upper part of this is the police reported data, and the lower part self-reported spousal data. And what you see there on the top, more women become victims of spousal violence according to the police reported data, yes. But at the same time, pay attention here, 70% of spousal violence is not reported to the police statistics. And this is different numbers here. I'm not sure why they here didn't indicate that there is an equal number of men and women who reported violence. They didn't clearly say that here. But they show that men and women become victims of different types of violence. So this is kind of how to read the statistics and why we have, potentially we have these very big difficulties in discussing these issues about male victims of intimate partner violence. But clearly men are victims and there is gender asymmetry in their facts. So and finally, so I'm actually talking right now about our study that we conducted with my colleagues in the United States, in Australia, in the UK, and Canada. So 5 of us got together and created this international domestic abuse network, as we called it, Highlighted Invisible Men. So we used a very innovative technology. we did our focus groups online. And what we did, we had 3 focus groups in each country. We have over 20 hours of interviews with men, 3 men in each focus groups, and we talked for 1 hour, or 1 hour and a half or 2 hours with 3 men about the experiences of violence in their relationships. We had a set of questions we asked in each country. We followed all the procedures we needed, ethical procedures. We had a psychologist present during these online sessions in case if men needed help. We made sure that men were in a safe, secure place. So we did it, and these are what I'm trying to present right now, the results of this work. The study objectives were to examine men's experiences of abuse. We wanted to see if there are differences in different countries in 4 Western international samples. And we also wanted to explore their help-seeking experiences and services available to them in these countries. So for the participants, we had 41 men who provided these very, very detailed stories about their violence. Average age was over all 4 settings, 49 years old, ethnicity mostly white, employed 90% of them. So contrary to some stereotypes that these are probably losers, men who have no jobs or something like that, no, these men all had, almost all of them, in Canada and Australia all had jobs. So this is our sample, and these are the main results. These are the main results. So we identified main themes and sub-themes. Actually what we have is a very rich source of information about all kinds of things. This is what I pay attention to in this particular presentation. So first we looked at the explained lived experiences of partner violence, and most of the men reported, as Michael did, it was power play, psychological aggression, controlling behavior, and physical attacks. These are the 2 types of that dominated the narratives of men in our samples. Then it was sexual abuse, exactly what Michael mentioned. Some people believe that how can it happen? Is it possible? Yes, it is possible. I will provide you some narratives of that. She insisted on sex as just an example of this one here. So then the other very important finding was that for men it was a very slow process of realization that it was actually abuse. Very slow process. So one man called it, even invented an analogy as a boiling frog, or I didn't call it abuse, so I'll provide you narratives about that. And then the next thing that we're interested in is to seek or not to seek help. And many men didn't seek any help, fearing ridicule. Those who sought help found no help, no support whatsoever, and faced lack of professional awareness and gender accountability, and finally reporting violence. Many men absolutely rejected the idea of being called victims. Not victim. I experienced abuse. I'm not a victim. So that's very different from men, from women, from females. Got reports of violence, how female consider themselves who experience violence in their relationship. So physical attacks. Again, here I just give you some examples, just simply to hear their voices, what we found. In terms of physical violence, what's that? Okay, physical violence. So she knocked me unconscious with a wine bottle, and I felt unconscious on the ground, and she was trying to light matches on my bed. Pretty severe violence. Dave in Canada, and the potatoes boiled over, so she threw the pot of boiled potatoes at me. Or she clapped the hell out of me with her fist that hurt. She also kicked me pretty damn hard in appropriate places. Or Daniel in the UK, she gave me a black eye. I had this great big black shiner. All kind of type of violence. I'm just selecting here, I mean, you can imagine how many we heard those stories and terrible, terrible things of violence that men experienced. The other one, here I completely agree with Michael, most of the men reported coercive controlling behavior. They call it power play, they call it skill. So, for example, 40 in the UK said she caught me smoking and she didn't do the normal thing, which was to yell and scream for 5 or 6 hours because she wanted me to go shopping. So, in order to get the whole process done quickly and get out shopping, she got me to leave dog food off the kitchen floor. Or my ex would then refer to me very frequently in front of my daughter as a motherfucker, fucking worthless bastard, and a whole plethora of things. That was much more traumatic for me than being punched in the face. And Danielle, I'll be listening to music in the evening, and she'll just come in and turn it off and say, you're not listening to it. So all kinds of things, minor things that men discussing the relationship just over and over again, pretty frequent or sometimes not quite frequent, but this is what it is to live in these relationships. Psychological abuse, this is a type of the controlling behavior, type of this kind of psychological pressure, and legal abuse that was Michael mentioned. We had an argument one time. She came over to my apartment, she started running all over my flat, trying to destroy everything, destroying things, destroying what people loved. Controlling behavior, that was a long, systematic process of alienating me from the people I cared about. And that's many men reported. Trying to alienate them from friends, for people who knew, for families, so for them not to get help that much. Threatened to kill children. Then she took the pill, she told me, I'm going to walk to the river with your son and kill him. And legal abuse. I felt blackmailed by her because she was always saying, when I started to realize that I was being abused, what are you going to do? I'm the woman in the case and you're the perpetrator, no matter what. So all kinds of things that have been used against men. Sexual abuse. And that's what we found took longer for men to realize that it was actually abuse. Nick in Canada, this will sound funny, but sexual abuse as well. Because who here has ever heard of a guy living with a woman, separate bedrooms from day one, and then she comes into your room and takes what she wants every night, and then goes back to her room? I'm thinking that's a screwed up woman. Or Scott in Australia, she insisted on sex every day because that's the way she knew I wasn't seeing someone else. Or Andy in Australia, it took me 18 months for me to finally click no. I was severely raped, not in the conventional sense of physical penetration, but it was forced sexual intercourse. Then another thing we found very important, and this is what probably we will find more when we get more information about from male victims, slow process of realization of partner violence. So Joel actually called it a boiling frog. I think it's a very individual level, the analogy with the boiling frog, where you put the frog in the boiling water and turn it up slowly. That's what it's like initially. It's not immediately punching straight away, it's just slightly more gently pushing, but it escalates over time, so you don't really notice that you're heading down an abusive relationship. So that's the point many men mentioned, very slowly. You don't call it that way, you don't run away from those relationships, you keep going, believing that it will be better, that's your responsibility, you are to blame, but then when you find yourself, it's kind of very late. Then there is no hope out there. This is another common theme among all 41 men we talked to. For example, in the UK 40, the only affordable facility there is for a man in an abusive relationship is a bit of rope. There is no help out there. There is nowhere to go. Or Tom in the United States. I finally called a couple of domestic violence centers after making hundreds of referrals to those places, and nobody has anything to do with men. Or Michael, there are no services, zero, you know, I felt like kind of like double victimized by that, I have to admit. And finally, Dave, I've been to lots of counselors and stuff like that and never had the help that I really needed. So this is what men kept saying us if they wanted to find any help. Lack of professional awareness, and this is about the really calling the helplines or calling the police. So probably I'll just read Tom's report. Anytime I went to the police myself with domestic violence issues, the police in Michigan always arrested the man, so I simply took it. So continuation of lack of professional awareness. For example, Luca in in Canada, the police came and they took her side immediately, and they were really mean to me. So, but it's not just negative experience. We actually had one man who experienced a positive experience with the police. And this is very interesting. Michael, in Canada, the police were great. I remember one young officer said to me, don't give up, don't give up, don't give up. I was a kid like your sons, don't give up. And I think that really helped me. Made me see that it wasn't just me that was hurting, it was the boys. He said, my father let my mother beat me for years, don't give up. So what do we see here? We see here that it's not the system that protects that particular man. It's actually one particular police officer who experienced the same thing, and he tells that victim, please don't give up because I was in the same situation. So what we need is actually systemic change, not just the change at the particular level of individuals who are there. And Michael said, I realized I was a victim once I got justice. Which is why it's so important for men to get justice, because this is where it's already kind of healing itself. Reporting violence. I'm not a victim. So John in Canada, the word victim is an awful word. When you read a pamphlet and go, oh yeah, am I a victim? And you run from it. Michael, the victim narrative will never allow you to heal. That's the thing you know. And Andrea in UK, even though I don't feel like a victim, I have to accept I've been abused many, many times. So there's definitely clear gender differences with females who men do not want to be called that way. And emphasis on personal responsibility, save blame. As it turned out, what we heard, men often believe that it's their responsibility to keep peace in the relationship. And if something is wrong, that was it, right? I guess Michael mentioned that. So, Steve, I was trying to figure out to solve the problem, and Michael, you blame yourself for everything that happens rather than your partner, especially with the abuse side of things. So, finally, conclusion. I guess what I wanted to say in my presentation is that we definitely need more understanding of females' abuse and males' victimization. We see there are clear common topics of men who experience violence. We need to learn more about it. As researchers, practitioners, and policymakers, we need to keep open mind in order to make it, to help men who experience violence in the relationship. So thank you so much, and if you have any questions, we'll discuss them. Thanks.
So we're going to have our 10-minute break. There are snacks outside. I was told to mention about the donations again because we are funded by your generosity. And the surveys will be available outside as well. If you fill them out with your name and your email address, we will do a draw at the end of the event for the wonderful prize of a Tim Hortons gift card. So in about 10 minutes, we'll come back and we'll do a Q&A. Thanks. back to their seats. Before we open it up to audience questions, I actually have a few questions that have been put together by the volunteers and from the live stream. So first, I have a question for Alexandra, which is, what can you say about the bidirectionality of intimate partner violence? Because I've seen that come up as a statistic a lot, that it's very frequent for both parties to be abusive to each other, more frequent than it is actually for a single party to be abusive.
Yeah, I guess bidirectionality or mutuality of violence, it's exactly the most prevalent type of violence, and this is what the Statistics Canada shows. A general social survey clearly says that, shows that about 4% of men and 4% of women reported being victimized. So meaning that there is definitely a great deal of mutualities going on in the relationship. And this is what, in theoretical terms, there are three major types of dynamics of violence going on in the relationship. And one is called situational violence, and this is the majority of violent couples suffer from this, and this is mutual violence. And there are two other types of violence. This is the intimate terrorism. This is one-sided violence, where only men or only women are become victims of violence. And mutual resistance, when women actually respond to violence perpetrated by men. So majority of incidents are mutual violence, and I think that is why it's important to talk about male victims. They become victims of violence in these incidents.
Thank you. We had a question for you, Michael, which was, how did your friends react, both male and female, to your situation when you tried to tell them, or when it became apparent what was going on? Was there any difference between your male and female friends?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would say that of the male friends that I told, I want to categorize this properly. There was a spectrum for sure, but of the male friends that I told, a small percentage of them got it. I don't know how else to say that. They just got it. They were like, oh my God, that's terrible. There was a middle percentage who were empathetic and compassionate towards me, but I could tell they didn't get it. It was like, and then there were a few that they weren't hostile towards me, but I could tell that they didn't want to talk about it anymore. They heard what I had to say, and that was it. They kind of just like turned away. I would say the female friends that I've talked to about it, most of them were in that first category of very compassionate and empathetic and seemed to understand it. And part of that, I think, and I'm theorizing here, of course, but they seem to have understood domestic violence from a female perspective, and so once they heard a male talking about it, it wasn't a huge leap for them to, kind of understand what had happened to me. And if I could, I'd like to just expand on that. One of the interesting things for me, one of the areas that I was really fearful of exposing myself was to my family. I have four siblings, one brother and three sisters, a couple of nieces and nephews that are almost the same age as me, and my mother is still alive. And I was really very concerned about how they would respond. I felt like a failure in front of them, and I didn't want to tell them. I was really pleasantly surprised at how supportive that they've been. I would almost say shocked. Not that I thought they were bad people, but I had my own fears about it. And once I come out and start talking about it, they've just been very supportive. So, thanks.
I have a quick follow-up question to that, which is, what kind of advice would you give to men in similar situations about coming out as suffering from this in an empowering way?
Yeah. Well, one of again, I can talk more from my own experience, but also having spoken with a number of men who have come out, if you will. And the interesting part for me was that I didn't really hear the message. I had gone to a therapist, and the therapist spoke to me about, I told her, I actually went there because I wanted, the first thing I told her, she said, why are you here? And I said, because I want to be more compassionate in my relationship. My partner has emotional dysregulation, and I want to be able to help her. Again, the helping theme, and the fixing theme. And after about 2 sessions, she said to me, you know, you're not the problem, I think your partner is. But I still wasn't hearing it. And it wasn't until I went to my medical doctor with all these problems that I talked about, and when she put me through a battery of tests and found absolutely nothing wrong, and I was sitting in her office, and this is a GP, and she said to me, okay, so it's not physical, what else is going on? And for some reason I told her, I don't know why, because I hadn't really told anybody else other than my therapist. And when that happened, she literally looked me in the eye and said, you've got to get out of there, it's killing you. And she kind of meant physically, but it was also killing me emotionally and psychologically as well. And so I guess the thing that I would say is start telling somebody. You know, talk to somebody. I hadn't talked to anybody until other than my therapist. And so talk to people. I know it's really hard, and I know it's risky. It feels risky, but talk to some people about what's going on. And that for me, gave me the courage to talk to more people. Now I talk to everybody. The people on the subway are not that interested, but I talk to everybody anyway. So, thanks.
If we have any questions from the audience, we have the audience response mic there. We just ask that you try and keep the statement of your questions relatively brief and concise, around 30 seconds. So, here we go.
So, Alexandra, you mentioned legal bias as one of the themes you talked about. And a while ago, I read a policy document from the BC government, and it was talking about how police officers and other institutional workers should assume that domestic violence situations have involved the man as the perpetrator abusing the woman, because, so the document said, most cases are of men abusing women. So when we have policy like this that's informing the institutions, how do we sort of address that?
That's a very, very good question. That's absolutely true. We have a primary perpetrator idea concept. And this is how men become arrested even if they call for help to the police. So, and that's a big issue. I guess one way to change it is to change the whole discourse of how we think about domestic violence. It's not just women's issue. And it, unfortunately, what I'm afraid it will take some time. We need to really talk more intensely about it, broadly about it, before that can change the policy situation. Men are quite aware of this, and women are quite aware of this. So that is why sometimes they use this as legal abuse. So nobody will help you, will be arrested, nowhere to go for you. So that is why I guess this is our goal, to make these policies more gender inclusive. So that the assumption will be that both men or women can become perpetrators.
That was sort of what I was going to ask, but just to expand on that a little bit, are either of you familiar with the policy changes more recently that's been affecting the law, especially in terms of the language being used? I've heard recently somebody was saying that certain people are pushing to have it completely, relabeled from domestic violence to violence against women, used as a broad term to speak about domestic violence.
My understanding was that there are some changes actually right now in Canada, more in a way to be more gender inclusive. That was my understanding. And at the policy level, and the language actually is more gender neutral. So there is no indication that male or female, don't say violence against women right now, realizing that there are male victims out there. So that is good news. So actually, we looked into this language of the discussion. However, the problem is still at the policy level, still at the very lower level of law enforcement. And this is where there are still very strong kind of stereotypes and ideas how the police should respond. And this is where we have this violence against women framework, with a very strong an idea of the primary perpetrator who is a man in all cases, how they believe that. So I guess this is what's still happening. So there is change going on the upper level of the discussion, of the debates, simply looking at the Statistics Canada and General Social Survey, because these policies, I guess they get this information, they see what's going on, But it needs some time before before the language changes and process changes at the lower levels, actually at the levels of ground level that works with victim and perpetrators.
Yeah, thank you. And I can speak to that a little bit in that in Toronto, through the center in Toronto, I've been working with some other people there, and we've been approaching and being approached by some of the police agencies in Toronto and in Ontario to speak to the issue of men being victims of domestic violence for their training programs. It's a long political process for that to happen, but it is beginning to happen. And as part of that initiative, I've personally been doing a very unscientific research. And I've been going to police on the streets and just asking them the question about, you know, domestic violence, how do you approach it, who's the perpetrator? And I'm finding there's almost a polarity response. Some of them respond very policy driven. They say, oh, well, it's, you know, it's 86% of the violence is men, you know, women victimized and men perpetrator. And then there's the other side of it where there are police officers, and these are frontline officers who say, well, you know, the first thing we have to do is we have to win an interview, and we have to figure out who's doing the violence, and we understand that it can be bilateral in many cases. And so there really is a polarity, and I think it almost seems to me, again, very non-empirical, is there's the group that just follows policy and does what they're told, and then there's a group that seems to be thinking for themselves and, you know, can see what the situations are really like. So.
I was also going to ask about the primary aggressor thing initially, but since that's been covered, there seems to be any number of examples you could give where what is accepted as abuse in one way or another, in one way, if you flip it 180 degrees, is simply not even thought of in the same way. So I wonder if you do believe that if there is a primary source or a multitude of sources, what would you think is the primary reason people have that seemingly inherent bias where they do have that bias?
Sorry, bias for?
To see abuse in one situation against women and you switch it around 180 degrees and it's not the opposite?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
I would say that this is what I call a stereotype. We have an idea of biases and stereotypes, and we hold to this, we like them, we believe in these terms, and it needs lots of evidence to show that the situation is very different. And it is why the education, more information in the media, and more statistics showing that men can be victims of violence is important, because it will probably break the stereotypes for the time. Yes, when we see, just imagine, we actually in our group, international group of scholars, we kind of discuss the situations. Just imagine the same situations that right now are quite accepted and tolerated, when women can hit the man or slap the man in public. Nobody reacts, nobody responds, nobody thinks it's a big issue. But just imagine the man would do the same to a woman. Everybody would on alert and say, oh God, that's violence, let's call the police, let's help her. Definitely very, very clear stereotypes right now. And what we need to do is try to change them. And the only change is probably the same what happened to female violence, victims of violence 40 years ago, when violence went unnoticed, undetected for women. And it took all those efforts of the feminist movement to change it and take it seriously. And now almost everybody agrees that violence against women is intolerable. We can't do these things. So I guess the same efforts we need to do in regards to men right now. And it will take efforts and time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I actually have a question that I thought of. It had been mentioned at some point, I think it was in your statistics, some of the men saying that they don't want to feel like they are part of a victimhood mentality. So how do you go about, and this can be for both of you, how do you go about convincing men that they have been the victims of domestic violence without turning them into victims by their mentality in a way that re-traumatizes them or prevents them from moving on?
That's a very good question. And what we did as a group of scholars, we even tried to think the term for men they would accept. Survivor, or they didn't like the term either. So, but it should be a language. We probably have to have a language that men will accept and will live with it, because they don't like victims. They're not survivors, because they think this is kind of puts on them kind of this idea of ideology of victimhood, and they're not victims. They don't look for that. They want the recognition of the situation and want the change. And they want fair laws and fair policies. This is what they want. So this is why I guess we have to come up with that language. We need to talk to men, really to come up with the idea of what they find their terms would be important. And we need to work on everything from the beginning, language, all these terms that we use. Because again, and this just proves how not much we know about the issue. Just a few, so that we're just in the beginning of that. But you don't have language to discuss things.
Yeah, and I think the extension of that is, as long as that ineffective language is there, that becomes a barrier for men coming forward. So I think it's a really important piece. If someone asks the question about what do we have to do to get men to come forward, well, part of it is have the language that men can accept. Yeah.
This is for Michael. I have a friend who is being abused. And I'd like to get a little insight from you, please, about how I might speak with him, bring him out a bit, to open the door for him to leave, to change this. You didn't tell us that much about how you actually went through what was going on, right?
Sure.
While you were getting out of there.
Yeah.
What would help?
Well, yeah, so you're right, I didn't talk too much about that. And I can speak a little bit more about that as part of answering your question.
Thank you.
But having said that, I think I have experience in having this conversation with many men, and I don't think there's one thing. What typically happens is that there's I would call it the straw that broke the camel's back, and for every man it's a different thing. Something happens that they make a realization that this isn't, there's something wrong with this. And some of the men, they don't even make the realization until after the relationship is over, that they went, oh, that's what that was. And in fact, I really came to more of a realization of what it was till afterwards. But the thing that got me out was why I said, talk to somebody. After my doctor told me, get out of there, I still didn't do anything with it for a couple of weeks. And then I finally got up the nerve, I will say, to call my sister, who happens to be a psychiatric nurse, so she had some experience and background in this type of things, but I also knew that she had been in abusive relationships before. As soon as I called her, she said, okay, I'm coming to get you right now. I said, hold on a second, I need a couple of weeks, and then I made a list of 4 things to take with me. But I would say it really is just about encouraging that person to talk about it with you, I would say, to begin with. Have they already talked with you about it?
Not about anything that would be called abuse.
Okay.
But I can tell he's being separated from his family. Other people around him are talking about this.
Yeah.
I'm not sure she's actually physically assaulting him, but she creates an immense drama that she used to control everything.
Yes, yeah. And again, for me, that had more impact on me than the physical abuse.
Right.
That's not true for everybody, but that was true for me. So, yeah, it really is about getting a conversation going. I would say getting a conversation going between you and him before recommending that he go somewhere else, and just really trying to let him know that maybe that or that you're seeing something. I actually had this conversation with a friend of mine after it happened, after I was out of it. He was my closest friend, my best friend, and afterwards he said to me, he said, I could see you were getting, his word was, consumed by this person. Right. And he said, I didn't know what I could say to you. And I said, if I believe, and I wasn't trying to blame him, but I said, I believe if you had told me that you saw me being consumed, that would have made a difference for me.
You know, it's a funny thing, because what happens, like coming from my point of view, or the outsider's point of view, there's
Yeah.
just a fear of giving offense,
Yeah,
of saying something that actually harms the relationship.
right,
And
yeah.
how valid do you think that fear is?
Well, I guess again, I think every situation is completely different in my opinion, and it depends how close the relationship is. So this person was my, best friend. I've known him for 30 years, and we've gone through a lot of things together. But I think if you speak, this is just my opinion again, but if you speak to him as a friend about what you see for him, not about the relationship, I wouldn't blame his wife or talk about what she's doing to him. Just the differences that you see in him. You see he's not, he's not doing things, he seems to be imploding or isolating or whatever. So I would speak about, for me, I'd speak about specifically what you see in him as your friend.
Okay, thank you.
I hope that helps. Yeah. And if at some point in time he does want help, the number's up there. That's a place for him to call if he does say I want to. That's the number for the cafe office. They have resources that they can, refer him to and so on.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Hi, I have what I think is a simple question. In the studies that you showed that showed gender parity and rates of intimate partner violence, did that correct for gay and straight relationships? In other words, male on male violence, female on female violence?
Good question. And no, the rates are higher for same-sex couples, particularly lesbian couples. The rates are higher.
Okay.
Yeah, Statistics Canada reports some of those data. They report in a very limited way, saying that it's just a few numbers, so the number is too small to report in basic statistics. But this year, first year, I see that they indicate that the number of violence in same-sex couples is higher, but this is what the other studies show.
Are those, in same-sex couples, is it also parity as well, or too early to tell?
What I understand is there are also these major types of violence that we see right now across different groups. So majority are parity, majority of incidents, but there are couples where one partner is a coercive and particularly violent, and the other is a main victim. So, and these are minority of those couples, but majority is also parity. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Just in this lull already that we have surveys for anyone who didn't get a chance to fill one out. They're right on that corner there, and if you can get them to me before the end of the Q&A, I'll put you in the draw.
For Alexandra, on campus and with other professors, how well is your presentation received? How well is the stats that you present? Is it accepted? Is there interest? Is there resistance?
So I would say that in this university it's going well. I just joined it 1 year ago. Maybe that was part of the reason why I joined it. It looks like people are very receptive. They really respect what I'm studying. However, it's not always easy. And when I presented at the conferences, international conferences, that was difficult. Even the issue itself, because I presented on female violence before, and now on male victims, and it definitely depends on the conference. And because there are more conferences when people come, those who share this point of view, they are aware of the things. But there are conferences with more people from different schools, and this is where it's difficult to discuss it. So I've got kind of negative experience presenting my findings.
You're finding when somebody has that preconceived idea that,
Yeah.
that they are resistant to hearing the message?
Absolutely resistant, yes. Don't want to hear that. They say this is not true. These statistics, so the findings are not based on good research, or this research has biases. There are different numbers they cite, and no desire to listen to a different story.
And what about support from the university for further research?
So I want just to learn about it, I guess, because I've just applied for the big federal grant. So we'll see if it happens. But my colleagues, those we work together in the United States and UK and Australia, were quite successful in getting funds for that. So hopefully in Canada we'll also get that.
Thank you.
We have no more questions.
Yeah, I'd like it's maybe more of a statement and maybe there's a question at the end of it. Thank you both for making the presentation that you did. I really appreciate it. I've had similar experiences that Michael talked about, except for the actual physical violence. One of the things that I guess maybe gets missed in a lot of this is, and Michael touched on it a little bit, is the children that are involved in these relationships. In my relationship with my ex now, during the time of the relationship, and it was about for 8 years, she would retaliate against the children. And I don't think, just kind of watching the research that's being done, I don't know how you'd be able to kind of include that in there. And that's a very scary one, because as a father, it becomes even more risky to, not to confront, but to kind of bring up these issues because of the fear of how much you can lose in the process. And when I finally did address the issues in my relationship, my biggest fear did happen. She did leave with the children, and she made all the claims that usually come from a person that's in an abusive relationship. She accused me of physically abusing the children and sexually molesting them. The reason I'm sharing this with you is I see a lot of the people that came up here to ask questions are young men, and men that are probably going to end up in relationships. And not to scare anybody, but this is something maybe we should all kind of work together on to address, is that the system as it stands right now, and everybody, you all touched on it here, is slanted in such a way that at every level of the justice system that you interact with, be it at the police level, just kind of the basic, or as high as in the court in front of a judge, they will always assume the worst of men. The slightest unfounded accusation will be taken as fact when it's presented by a mother in court. So I just want to kind of share that with everybody. It was great to hear from Michael. It kind of helped me feel a little bit kind of empowered. Hearing Alexandra talking to all those other men was also for me really kind of empowering. There's a couple times during the presentation where I felt it was kind of like about to come to tears, especially the bit about children. It's been a year for me, and I'm still kind of going through that process. I'm still trying to get my children back, even at the 50% time. I think one of you touched on it earlier. It's tough. It's really tough, and we do have to kind of come together to start addressing these issues. And it's not just we have to talk about it as individuals. We have to act and make these policy changes that are destroying people's lives. And I'm assuming everybody here knows the impact on a father when you take their children or you take their family away. It's, you know, there's a lot of negative things from suicide to substance abuse and so on. I just want to put that out, and then just to see if there's anything that you would suggest that any of us here can do specifically to tackle these policy changes that do need to happen, because right now, anybody that goes into court, you're gonna come out losing your children. All it takes is for somebody to just make a false allegation against you. And just one last comment, I would like to offer my experience, if you're still doing research, to offer my experience to kind of maybe contribute to that, so maybe at the end I can share my contact information. Thank you.
Actually, I wanted to reassure you that we did find more than 50% of all, more than 50% of all men in our study reported issues about children. That was a major barrier for them not to live in relationships.
That's right, it is.
Absolutely.
If you lose.
It's losing children, or when women used children as hostages, use them against men, threaten children, help with children in order for men to stay or do whatever they wanted them to do. So that's a very big issue. I'm sorry, I didn't really kind of go with it in detail, but that's as many men reported. Yeah, so it's very serious.
Okay, if we don't have any more questions, I can offer up to each of you if you want to make a final statement or final point.
I would say, what's up on the screen there, my real passion is for men to be safe, which means whatever that means to you. But if, like the gentleman was up here asking about a friend, I really appreciate that he came up to ask that. I hope I was helpful, but if you know somebody, if you are somebody or you know somebody that's in a situation, one of the reasons why I say be safe is because 1 second before she approached me with that knife in her hand, if someone had have asked me, do I think my life was in danger, I would have said no. 1 second later, I would have said yes. It was a benign conversation. And so my point of that is that often this abuse becomes progressive, it gets worse over time, and you never know when it might become dangerous to you. Almost all the men that I know that were assaulted for the very first time in their relationships didn't believe that it could possibly happen. So, if you think anyone that's in a relationship, even if there's no physical violence yet, help them in some way. And if that's you, get some help. That's my message.
Yeah, and I would like to say that although there are so many gaps in our understanding of the issue of violence against men in intimate relationships, and we also discussed it right now, and we presented this today, I feel somewhat optimistic that we are having this meeting tonight. And I think this is how it starts. When you ask me questions about how we change the policies, policies will change if we have these discussions, if we have these debates, if we publish the findings, if those findings are heard by the policymakers. This is how the change will happen, slowly but surely. So that's my message.
Okay, let's thank our speakers for so our last two orders of business are to draw for the prize Gordon McHale in the audience. Is he gonna leave?
Yes. I was introduced to Gordon and he's not here.
Okay, that's unfortunate for Gordon. I might mispronounce this. Bijan? You get a wonderful gift, a Tim Hortons gift card.
I'm happy to donate it back. Yeah, next year.
You gonna make me draw again?
No,
As a token of appreciation for our guests, we have got them a small gift. Our speakers. Very pretty SFU A and B.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all again for coming, and I hope you have a nice week.